The race against time. Why Washington appears determined to cripple emerging economies. Across the corridors of global power, a quiet anxiety now shapes the behavior of the United States. Across global power centers, a quiet unease increasingly guides Washington's choices. Beneath the confident rhetoric of strength, leadership, and global security lies a more troubling reality: an economic structure increasingly dependent on monetary expansion and sustained only by the continued dominance of the US dollar. The aggressive posture now visible in Washington's foreign policy is not merely ideological or strategic. It is rooted in a deeper structural dilemma tied to debt, monetary policy, and the accelerating rise of a multipolar world. At the heart of this dilemma is the monetary architecture that has defined the American economy since the global financial crisis of 2008. When that crisis threatened to collapse the financial system, the US Federal Reserve turned to an extraordinary instrument known as quantitative easing. In practical terms, it meant creating vast amounts of new money to purchase government bonds and financial assets, injecting liquidity into the financial system to stabilize markets and stimulate economic activity. What began as an emergency measure soon evolved into a structural pillar of the American economy. Before the crisis, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood below $1 trillion. Over the following years, repeated rounds of quantitative easing expanded it dramatically, reaching nearly $9 trillion at its peak. At the same time, interest rates were pushed close to zero for prolonged periods, allowing corporations, financial institutions, and the federal government to borrow at unprecedented levels. The consequences were predictable. Cheap credit fueled massive corporate borrowing, inflated asset markets, and encouraged the federal government to expand spending without restraint. The result today is a national debt approaching $40 trillion, with annual interest payments alone nearing $1 trillion. The system now relies on continuous liquidity and financial engineering to maintain stability. Yet, the real foundation supporting this structure lies beyond American borders. Quantitative easing works only because the US dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency. Global trade, financial markets, and central banks rely heavily on dollars and US Treasury bonds. This constant international demand allows Washington to finance its debt by effectively creating money that the rest of the world continues to absorb. Every international dollar transaction carries an invisible advantage for the United States. Global demand for dollars allows the country to borrow cheaply, import goods in exchange for financial instruments, and maintain a consumption-driven economy financed by external capital. In effect, the world helps sustain American debt through its reliance on the dollar-based system. However, this arrangement contains a dangerous contradiction. The more Washington relies on money creation to sustain its economy, the greater the long-term pressure placed on the credibility of the dollar itself. Quantitative easing can act as a hidden tax on global dollar holders because it dilutes purchasing power through monetary expansion. Over time, this undermines the trust that supports dollar dominance. Recent financial developments suggest that this trust may already be shifting. For the first time in decades, foreign central banks have begun reducing their holdings of US Treasury securities. Countries are increasingly hedging against the inflationary consequences of American monetary policy and exploring alternative financial systems that reduce dependence on the dollar. This emerging shift coincides with the rapid growth of new geopolitical coalitions. Among them, the expanded BRICS alliance represents the most significant structural challenge to the existing financial order. The bloc now encompasses a large share of the world's population, natural resources, and economic output. More importantly, it is quietly building financial mechanisms designed to reduce exposure to dollar-based systems. Within this emerging architecture, trade between major economies is increasingly conducted in local currencies rather than dollars. Russia now conducts the overwhelming majority of its trade with BRICS partners using national currencies. Brazil and China have deepened their financial cooperation through alternative payment systems. India and the United Arab Emirates have expanded bilateral trade using the rupee and dirham. Across Africa, major financial institutions have begun connecting directly to Chinese payment networks. At the same time, new financial technologies are accelerating the transition toward a more diversified global system. Digital settlement platforms such as BRICS and related blockchain-based frameworks are being tested to facilitate cross-border transactions without relying on the SWIFT network or the US dollar. These systems are designed not as attacks on the dollar, but as insurance policies against financial coercion and asset freezes that have become increasingly common in modern geopolitics. For Washington, these developments represent more than financial experimentation. They signal the potential erosion of the system that has underpinned American power for more than 70 years. If global trade increasingly bypasses the dollar, the United States would lose the unique privilege of financing its deficits through global demand for its currency. Against this backdrop, recent shifts in American foreign policy begin to take on a different meaning. The United States has increasingly embraced a strategy that limits large-scale military invasions while relying on a broader array of pressure tools. Sanctions, tariff threats, financial restrictions, political destabilization campaigns, and targeted military actions have become preferred instruments of influence. Rather than occupying countries with massive ground forces, Washington increasingly pursues short engagements and indirect regime change mechanisms designed to shape outcomes without prolonged military commitments. This less is more approach reflects both strategic calculation and political necessity after the costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet many of the states subjected to these pressures share a striking common characteristic. They are either resource-rich economies capable of conducting energy trade outside the dollar system, or they are countries actively participating in alternative financial structures connected to emerging geopolitical blocs. Energy producers capable of pricing oil or gas in non-dollar currencies pose a direct challenge to the monetary system that supports American financial dominance. Likewise, countries involved in the development of alternative payment systems weaken the enforcement power of sanctions and financial restrictions that Washington has long used as instruments of foreign policy. In this context, geopolitical tensions increasingly intersect with financial strategy. Sanctions and tariff threats are often framed as responses to political disputes, yet they also serve the function of discouraging countries from diversifying away from the dollar. The logic is simple. If alternative financial systems become viable, capital may begin flowing out of the dollar ecosystem. However, this approach contains its own paradox. Coercive economic tools can impose short-term pressure, but they rarely build the trust required to sustain long-term cooperation. When countries experience sanctions, asset freezes, or financial isolation, they are given strong incentives to develop alternative systems that cannot be weaponized against them. The more frequently these tools are used, the greater the motivation for other states to escape the structures that enable them. This dynamic has given rise to what some analysts describe as a world minus one scenario. In such a system, the United States remains the most powerful military actor, yet increasingly distances itself from the global institutions and economic frameworks it originally helped to create. Instead of reinforcing those institutions, Washington increasingly operates outside them, relying on unilateral pressure and strategic coercion. Ironically, this behavior may be accelerating the very transition it seeks to prevent. Each round of sanctions encourages new payment systems. Each tariff threat encourages new trade alliances. Each financial restriction motivates countries to develop independent settlement mechanisms. Meanwhile, the structural pressures within the American economy continue to grow. The dependency on monetary expansion remains unresolved. Debt levels continue to rise. Interest payments consume larger portions of government revenue. And the global financial environment that once made these dynamics sustainable is gradually evolving What appears outwardly as geopolitical assertiveness may therefore reflect a deeper sense of urgency. The United States is attempting to preserve a system that allowed it to finance prosperity through global monetary dominance. Yet, the more aggressively it tries to enforce that system, the faster other nations search for ways to operate beyond its reach. Quantitative easing, once introduced as a temporary emergency measure, has become the central vulnerability in this evolving landscape. The policy allowed the United States to stabilize its economy and extend its financial influence, but it also created a structural dependency that cannot easily survive the decline of dollar hegemony. If global financial diversification continues, the mechanisms that once allowed Washington to export inflation and finance debt through the rest of the world may gradually weaken. For now, the dollar remains deeply embedded in global finance, and any transition away from it will unfold slowly. Yet, the direction of travel is becoming increasingly visible. Emerging economies are building alternatives not out of hostility toward the United States, but out of necessity to protect their own sovereignty and financial stability. In this sense, the accelerating tensions in global geopolitics reflect more than ideological competition. They are symptoms of a system under strain. The race unfolding before the world is not simply about military power or political influence. It is about whether the architecture of the post-war financial order can survive the rise of a multipolar world. And if the current trajectory continues, history may record that the very tools used to defend that order ultimately hasten its transformation. For deeper analysis across a wide spectrum of geopolitical, economic, and social issues, and to explore a rich archive of thought-provoking articles, I invite you to visit my website at www.oblongmedia.net, where a treasure trove of insightful content awaits. Thank you. This is an Oblong Media Global Intelligence Analysis.